walking into Green Island, and he had something, either it was on his knee or his arm. Yeah, yeah. But you've had like some hip or knee issues, right? Oh, is it really? Yeah. Do you have to take shots for it, or just yeah? Is it working? Kind of. Yeah. Oh wow. Which is pretty ambitious. I mean, yeah. Oh my word, hey, that's scary. Yeah. Yeah. I see. Yeah. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. The embolism is scary. Yeah. Well, and they don't want you to move. I mean, they don't want you to do anything. So, yeah. Well, I didn't know it was that bad. I just heard that he had like shoulder surgery or something. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm hoping it's over, or at least you're on the mend. Yeah. 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 Well, I do too. Well, it's good to see you. Tell him I said hello. All right, Teresa, am I good? Text me if I'm not. Am I good on my sound? All right. All right. Good morning, everyone. Where's my bell? Here we go. Yep. Back to the new year. Morning. Well, good morning and welcome back as we somewhat come to order. Yep. Some type of a football game. Oh no, 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 no. I probably do. Seriously, I probably do need my left shoulder looked at because it pops and like right here hurts. But I'm not doing it until. Well, I need to, but we're going to Scotland again in August, and so I'll get it looked at after that. I'm not risking a surgery before that. Well, good morning, welcome, 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 and yeah. So I was telling someone I don't know if it was Georgia was that good or TCU was that bad, but I figured that y'all would weigh in and let me know which one it would be. So. But yeah, did enjoy watching the football game. So I know a lot of folks. My phone was lighting up with all the gracious Georgia fans telling me how wonderful they are, uh, and how wonderful I'm not. Right. But anyway, welcome back. I should say. I think I heard someone say, "Are we still in Daniel?" Yes, we are. We are. Hopefully, we're on probably we're probably in the seventh inning to kind of give you some idea. We left, as I understand it, I'm going off memory. We finished chapter 7. We're going to look at chapter 8 today, but wanted to sort of give you a little bit of a timeline that's just to our Bible study here. Next week, Connor and I are going to be out of town, so John's going to fill in for me next week, and then if I doubt we'll finish all of chapter 8 today. Maybe we might. Uh, if we do, that puts us with 4 chapters left. Let's just say it takes 6 to 8 weeks to finish that. If that's the case, we should finish Daniel by the end of February, or at least that's my goal. I think I mentioned last time, or at least previously, that since we're in the Old Testament, we might pick up another prophet, maybe a minor prophet, Micah. Might try to run through Micah. So then if that's the case, we would pick Micah up in March. Holy Week and spring break, we normally don't meet. They're actually the same week this year. So you can April the 4th, we won't meet. Don't worry about writing these down. I just want to kind of give you a timeline. But if that's the case, and I'm able to hold all those dates, then we would finish Micah probably around May the 9th, which would be about the time, maybe we'd be either on the 9th or the 16th for our last visit before we break, and that's typical for our life. So if you are wondering, at least what the spring is going to look like, winter, spring, hopefully that'll be what we do. So unless y'all don't want to do Micah and you want to do something else, but it needs to be a shorter book just so that we'll have time to finish it. And then probably in the fall of next year, probably we'll move back to the New Testament and maybe pick up another epistle, thinking maybe we've done all the Gospels, we've done Romans, we've done Ephesians. I don't think we've looked at Galatians, but we did the Ephesians, Philippians. I think we did Colossians one time in the summer, but I'm thinking maybe what we call the Johannine writings, John 1, John 2, John 3. Maybe look at that and then see how that maybe matches up to the Gospel of John. So that'd probably be what we'll do in the fall, unless y'all have something else that Mimi's not here to tell us what we're going to need to do, so she picked Daniel. So, but unless there's something else that's just burning inside of you to study, we'll probably go that route. Or if there's normally about every 2 to 3 years, I like to pick up a non-biblical book. So if there's a book that you're reading or that you want to read, and it's maybe we can look at, just let me know and maybe send me an email or what have you, and we can maybe add that into either the fall or the spring of 2024. So, yeah, well, unfortunately, with all the stuff that's going on inside what we plan at St. Paul sometimes a year in advance, and then when you look at our annual conference and some of our denominational stuff, we're already thinking into 2025. So, interesting as it might be. All righty. Anything else? I think there are prayer pads going around. If you're at home watching, welcome, and just send in any prayer requests via an email from Betty Hips. I know that went out yesterday, so it should be in your inbox. And then we will make a copy like we normally do, and then Betty will combine the list and send that out tomorrow or Thursday. All right, any announcements we need to touch on before we begin? All good? Nothing in the community that we need to think about? All right, well, let's pray. Lord, today as we gather in your name, for this we are grateful. Thank you for the break and the time of celebrating what we know as Christmas, what we see in the Scriptures, the Incarnation. And then as we turn in from one year to the next, and on one level it's just a day, but there's something psychological that's tied to it, beginning anew and afresh. So guide us in this new year, we pray, O Lord. We place our trust in you, not just for our own lives, but the lives of our family, for our community, and even in the world. What we want is to be your witnesses. So use this study, this time, as a time of reflection, as a time of growth, as a time of learning, so that all of it could be leveraged with the addition of your Holy Spirit that forms the nature of Christ inside of us. We exist for that. On one level, that gives you praise. On the next level, it is a witness of what it's like to be connected to you and to not just be a believer, but someone who lives fully in your kingdom. And so that's what we pray for, oh God. However that takes place, we trust you. So whether we're here inside this room or whether we're joining at home or even for those that join us around the world or watch at different times later than today or even tomorrow, what have you. All of this, oh God, we place in your hands, and we ask it now in your name. Amen. All right, so just to recap, since we've been gone for a few weeks, Daniel's broken down into two sections. The first part of the book of Daniel is historical events that happened to Daniel himself or to some of Daniel's buddies. And that is for the first, I think, 6 chapters of the book of Daniel. When we transition into chapter 7 through the rest of the book, which is 12 chapters, so 7 through 12 has to do with visions that Daniel received throughout his life. And the first major vision is chapter 7. And chapter 7, that vision is very similar to chapter 2 in the book of Daniel. Chapter 2, you might remember that Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. He has this big statue. The statue is divided into different sections. There's a head that's gold. There's a chest area, I think, that's silver, bronze, waist area, and then legs, I think, are iron and what have you. And then there's a big boulder that appears, and it's hurled, and it destroys the statue. And the breakdown of the statue, from how Daniel interprets the dream to Nebuchadnezzar, is that it talks about different empires. And that's similar to chapter 7. But instead of Nebuchadnezzar having the dream or the vision, Daniel has the vision, but it deals with the different empires, beginning with the Babylonians and then moving on into the future, eventually into Rome. So the first empire, and in chapter 7, it's dictated by animals or quasi-beast looking. You've got, a leopard that has wings. You've got, I think, a bear. I can't remember. One of them's like a bird that has animal, other, maybe like a bird and a lion mixed together or something. But each animal represents a different kingdom. And we know from history what those 4 kingdoms are. The Babylonians are in the time of Daniel, at least for the major part of his life. After the Babylonians, you have the Medes and the Persians, which would eventually just become the Persians. So you have the Persian Empire. After the Persians, you have the Greeks, and then after the Greeks, you've got the Romans. What's different about chapter 7 than in Daniel's vision, what's different about Daniel's vision than Nebuchadnezzar's dream, is that you also have the introduction of this one that is anti of God. And so there's a lot of debate in chapter 7 about is it someone who is like an antichrist, or is it the antichrist? So, if you want to go back and look at that, you can go in our archives. We spent some time of that before Christmas. And there's debate on it. My view is that it is there are people in the world and history that are opposite of God. And so they, in their time period, are it's like an antichrist or an anti-God person. We're going to look at one today, okay? So I don't think that Daniel's talking about antichrist in the future, like how some people interpret Revelation, as much as he's talking about in Roman time periods. Because I think chapter 7 deals with the first advent, the coming of Christ, that the Gospels describe, not the second advent that is described by the latter parts of the book of Revelation. Now, there are people who are a great deal smarter than me, more knowledgeable when it comes to the Bible, and they would argue extensively that it's talking about second advent, all right? But either way, regardless of where you sit on that particular issue, the main teaching of chapter 7 is that God is the one that is sovereign and in control, which has been the consistent theme throughout the entire book of Daniel. Every aspect of the book of Daniel is just it is a reverb that goes on and on and on about the sovereignty of God. You see it in every chapter, whether it be something historical in Daniel's life or whether it be even in these visions. Because when we looked at chapter 7, all the things that was going on, what's critical to this is that God is the one that is in control. All this is happening in front of him, and when he's had enough of it, he just kind of turns the page. And so that's comforting, and we spent some time about that before the break. Again, if it's something that maybe if you missed that lesson and you want to go back, you can just go to like our YouTube channel and see it. All that's archived. But the same thing is going to be today when we look at chapter 8, because chapter 8 is a different vision, similar to chapter 7, that has to deal with something in the future, this time 400 years in the future, about a specific person that other books of the Bible talk about. But who has the Bible that might have the Apocrypha in it? You know what the Apocrypha is? The non-canonical books. Anybody raised in the Catholic Church growing up, you know the Apocrypha. So what's different about, one of the things that's different about Catholics and Protestants are some of the books of the Bible. So the Apocrypha are the intertestamental books from Malachi to the Gospel. And there's probably 13, 18. The most famous ones are 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Maccabees. And the reason why I mention that is those books talk about this person. Again, this is if you're on Jeopardy. Actually, I was watching. Y'all watch Jeopardy? I like watching Jeopardy. And so this came up. It was like a couple of weeks ago. Not Daniel, but I mean the Apocrypha and things like that. And I thought, I wish I would record it and could have showed it the next day or something. But it does talk about this particular person and some of the things that under what he did to the people in Jerusalem, to Jews at that time, and then what happened and how there was restoration and things of that nature. So that's probably more than what you want to know. It's interesting to read those books, the Apocrypha books. For Protestants, they're not considered canonical, which means they didn't make the cut. But for Catholics, they did. So anyways, let me stop and just open up for questions, just because I gave you like a 10-minute summary of 7 chapters of the book of Daniel, which is a lot, right? So I mean, we've been at it since September. Anything not clear? All good? All right, so now we're going to look at Daniel's second vision, which is, and it's contained all in chapter 8. So if somebody would do this, if somebody would read verses 1 through 14, it's not a very long chapter, but this is going to be, the chapter itself is broken down into 2 parts. 1 to 14 is the vision. 15 to 27 is the interpretation. So if somebody would read chapter 8, be very courageous at the beginning of the year and read the first 14 verses, that'd be great. Nobody's ambitious. All right. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after that which appeared to me at the first. And I saw in the vision, and when I saw, I was in Susa the citadel, which is the province of Elam. And I saw in the vision, and I saw in the vision, and I was at, I guess this is Ewa Canal. I raised my eyes and saw, and behold, a ram standing on the banks of the canal. It had 2 horns, and both horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. I saw the ram charging westward, northward, and southward. No beast could stand before it, and there was no one who could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased and became great. As I was considering, behold, a male goat came from the west across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground. And the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. He came to the ram with the two horns, which I had seen standing on the bank of the canal, and he ran at him in his powerful wrath. I saw him come close to the ram, and he was enraged against him, and struck the ram and broke his two horns. And the ram had no power to stand before him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled on him. And there was no one who could rescue the ram from his power. Then the goat became exceedingly great, but when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and instead of it there came up four conspicuous horns towards the west winds of heaven. Out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great towards the south, towards the east, and towards the glorious land. Some people might have like beautiful land there. And it grew great, even to the host of heaven. And some of the host and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. It became great, even as great as the prince of the host. Some people might have the Prince of Peace. And the regular burnt offerings were taken away from him, and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown. And a host was given over to it together with the singular burnt offering because of transgression. And it will throw truth to the ground, and it will act and prosper. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one who spoke, "For how long is this vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgressions that made desolate, and giving over of the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot?" And he said to me, "For 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state." All right, that's an interesting vision, is it not? So, does anybody dream like this? With even if you eat a bunch of Chinese food, I guess. So, rams and goats, and I don't think I've ever had a dream that involved those types of things. But nonetheless, Daniel has a vision. Whether it's a dream or a vision, we don't know. But this is at least the second vision that he had. So we do know when we get to the end of the chapter, what I'm going to tell you, it'll become even clearer. The event that the vision is describing is about 400 years in the future of Daniel. It did involve a guy named Antiochus IV. He is one of the four rulers that will take over after Alexander the Great. So Alexander the Great is the goat, and Alexander the Great's rule was, as for a military leader, Alexander the Great was phenomenal. Took over the Persians, was actually expanded the Greek world all the way over to the other side, of India. But he's short-lived. I think some of you know his story. He dies young. His kingdom, or at least his ruling arms, it is divided amongst his four generals. One of the generals, if you take one of the generals that would be over Jerusalem, Syria, that whole area, that eventually, he's not the initial general, but not long after that initial general dies, this guy takes over. And he is just a brutal, brutal person, particularly to Jerusalem, to the temple, to the Jews. That is described in 1st and 2nd Maccabees. That's the reason why I mentioned those books on the front end of what this guy does in that period. His rule was from 75 BC to 163 BC. And so the vision is describing this time period, all right? And that's universally pretty much accepted. And so the events of chapter 8 take place between, probably somewhere between 4 and 5, roughly, chapters 4 and 5. It involves a place called the Citadel of Susa. Have you ever heard of the Code of Hammurabi, which is like the Babylonian rules, similar to like Ten Commandments and things like that, that actually was found in this place. I mean, this, if you've never heard of Code of Hammurabi, that's worth noting because that's like the Rosetta Stone for world history. When they were able to find this, I mean, this gives you insight into civil life in the ancient world. I mean, it's a major find in history. Well, Susa is the place where they found that. So Susa is a large city and an influential city inside of both the Babylonian world and eventually the Persian world. Are y'all cold? I mean, how are we on? Okay, we're all right. You might just be under the vent there. So, so anyway, this is just some extra information. So we do have a ram and a goat, and so let's just kind of work through the vision at least, and see if we can pick up some other things. But these are just some of the main items that we're going to discuss here in the next few minutes before our break. So, so as we begin back at the beginning of the chapter, this is in the reign of King Belshazzar. That, again, is 4 and 5, between chapter 4 and 5. So this is at the very end of the Babylonian Empire and the beginning of the Persian Empire when Daniel had the vision. Now, the events that he's describing is not here. They're in the future, long after the Persian Empire, but Daniel received the visions between 4 and 5. Chapter 4 is the end of Nebuchadnezzar. Chapter 5 is where we have some other Babylonian kings, and then eventually you have the setting it up for the Persians to come in. All right? So I just want to kind of orient you and some where the vision sits inside of the book of Daniel. Again, you have this citadel that's mentioned, that means historical place. Whether or not Daniel was in that place historically or just saw himself in that place, we don't know. Some versions, if you have a study Bible, the study Bible might lean in one or the other way. Might say Daniel was actually there, or maybe Daniel was not there. We just don't have enough information other than, but he sees himself in that place, whether there in the vision or there historically. There was a palace that was there in Susa. It was a fortress, very, very strong city. It's about 220 miles east of like the Babylonian center, and about 150 miles north of the Persian Gulf. So that'll kind of give you an idea about where the city was located. It's a royal city, it's a city of just prominence. The Code of Hammurabi, they found that, archaeologists discovered that in 1901. Again, just Susa in the Old Testament, Esther, Nehemiah, they both lived in those cities. It's a place of noteworthy. There are some people that think that Daniel, his body was laid to rest there. We don't know. But anyways, all that stuff, I'm just highlighting some things that might show up if you have a study Bible, what might show up there. But he looked up in the vision. He sees a ram. It's got two horns. It's standing beside the canal, and the horns were long. Often when Persia went into battle, they did carry the image of a ram. So that's where most scholars equate this with Persia. That's one of the reasons why. But he's watching the ram. Nobody, the ram charged to the west and to the north and to the south. No other animal was able to stand against him, which was true of the Persians at that time. So, the Persians, they move west into, they eventually are stopped in Greece, but they moved up north to just south of what is now China, and they were over, not quite into India, but that'll just give you geographically the historical Persian empire. Very large empire, multiple rulers. They were in power for, well over a century. The Persians at that time were they were the biggest person on the block. And obviously if you Google up Persian kings or Persian battles or whatever it may be, I mean, you can see that. I mean, they're for if you're in power for the better part of 150 years. I mean, you're going to fight a lot of battles. You're going to have a lot of rulers, things of that nature. Cyrus was one of the first major ones, but it goes Xerxes. You might have heard of that, or Artaxerxes. I mean, those are all some of the major kings during under the Persians. So, I mean, they actually go as far down as to Egypt and Ethiopia to the south, just to kind of give you an idea again. But, although Daniel doesn't name other beasts or other animals, the assumption is that, again, no other empire or group of people, were successful in defeating the Persians. They were large and powerful. At that point, no other kingdom controlled as much territory as the Persians did. So in power for a long time, and then beginning in verse 5 through 8, all of a sudden there's an introduction of a goat who had a prominent horn or between his eyes, and he came from the west. So where's my stuff? Y'all see my marker? Oh, here we go. This is not to scale, and it's not even going to look good, but if this is sort of like the Middle East, all right, if you come from the west, Persia was ruling here all the way, not quite close to the Mediterranean, up into Greece. So the goat comes this way. The main power or source of power for Persia was obviously in the middle here, Iraq, Iran, that whole area. And so that's what Daniel is describing, that there is a goat or another animal has horns or has a horn, does hit or have some level of striking the ram, and the ram is powerless to stand against him. Now, this is the introduction of Alexander the Great in the vision. And so Alexander's... All right, so just here's another Jeopardy question. Does anybody know Alexander the Great's father? It's like Philip. Yeah, good for you. You like cheating. Were you looking it up or something? No, I'm just kidding. Okay, yeah. So Philip II was the ruler. He starts well, but is only in power for just, I think, maybe 7 years or 6 years. He dies. Alexander the Great takes over the army, and just within the span of just maybe a few years, conquers everything, and actually conquers more than what the Persians ever did. So Daniel in verses 5 through 8 is describing vision language, Alexander the Great, and Alexander the Great again. Under this now is the introduction of the Greek Empire, overthrows the Persians, and notice how the goat is described as almost hovering over the ground. I don't know if you saw that. So verse 5, as I was considering, again, now this is Daniel considering the ram, the Persians, behold, a male goat came from the west across the face of the beholder without touching the ground. What that describes is the speed of Alexander the Great. Just in a short amount of time, he pretty much conquers the world around him. Philip, his dad, united all of of Greece with Macedonia, and they were planning to attack the Persians when Philip was murdered. Alexander's son takes over, and this is around maybe 336 BC or so, and within a year and a half, he launched an attack against the Persians and won his first major battle, and then it just kept on going, and in the span of maybe like 3 to 4 years, conquered all of the Persian Empire. So, that just kind of gives you some insight into how how successful Alexander the Great was, and eventually how powerful he would become. Notice that the goat has great rage against, or anger or wrath against the ram. It is well documented that Alexander the Great hated the Persians. And I mean, Greeks were incredibly bitter over Darius the First. Again, this is in the beginning of the Persian Empire. Their invasions, obviously Xerxes, his son. Yeah, I think I mentioned, have you ever seen that movie, The 300? All right, so that's talking about Xerxes. And can't think of who the Spartan ruler was at this time, but that, the 300 defended at this. You can watch the movie if you want. I mean, but anyway, it's a Hollywood version of an actually historical battle. But they hated the Persians, and obviously Alexander the Great, when he received the reins, wanted to rectify all the, I mean, if you are subject to raids for, a number of years, and you can imagine what that's like in the ancient world, right? So when you get the reins of power and you have might, it's easy to see there's a level of hostility that the Greeks had towards the Persians, but they are able to conquer the Persians. Under Alexander the Great, his empire was about almost just shy of 2 million square miles. Just to give you an idea of how vast his empire was under his rule. He died young, 32 years of age. One of the great things about Alexander the Great is he took the Greek world with him wherever he would go, and which made it easy eventually for the spread of the gospel, because he also united the language, Koine Greek, and the Bible's written in Koine Greek. And so even though this was a couple hundred years before you would have the spread of Christianity, the remnants of that is all there. So this is one of the reasons why the church was able to spread so quickly in the first, under the Roman rule world, is because of common language and accessibility to roads. So we think, you can pull up on your phone and talk to somebody around the world like it's nothing, but back in the ancient world, you got to think about how it's word of mouth, right? And in order to do that, you got to be able to have a common language, and you got to have accessibility of travel. So if you study evangelism, one of the things that aided the early church was that it's formed inside of a time when it's easy for people to travel and they have a common language. It might be one of 2 or 3 different languages, but Greek being one, Latin being another by the time of the early church. But all of this has remnant back to here, because up until then you didn't have the same common language like you did after Alexander the Great. So, anyways, just that's extra. That's not in the book of Daniel. But if I can see y'all were asking, hey, how does this relate to the spread of the gospel? Well, there you go. So, yes.
Was Greece the one that was tolerant of various religions?
Well, actually, they all were to some degree. So if you might remember, in the first part of the book of Daniel, even under Nebuchadnezzar, each empire would have its own gods. But the Assyrians were the ones that they would come in and they would force everything upon you. The Babylonians who conquered the Assyrians would be okay with your level of religious structure as long as it didn't violate theirs, right? And the Greeks followed, the Persians similar. They would have their own gods. And inside of if they conquered your area, you were given some level of freedoms as long as it didn't violate the major issues of the empire. And so there is some level of tolerance. What you'll find with the Babylonians and the Persians is they're not as, they see Yahweh as less than. All right, so the God of the Old Testament. And obviously they're the Jewish religious laws, ceremonial laws about how to practice their religion, dietary issues, worship, things like that. It's non-negotiable for Judaism. So there's always going to be a rub in a polytheistic structure compared to a monotheistic structure, which is what Judaism is, and Christianity and Islam, right? So they're the three monotheistic religions in the world. But the Babylonians and the Persians, polytheistic, so they would acknowledge that for instance, the Jews have their own religious deity and their own religious structure, but it was always going to be subservient to whatever the empire is. The Greeks do the same thing, and so do the Romans. The Roman structure is a little bit different than, say, the Greeks, because what the Romans wanted more than anything else is for you to be at peace, all right, and for you to pay your taxes. You had a lot of freedom as long as you did that. But the day that you disrupted the peace, the Romans would come in with heavy force, their legions, and they would wipe you out. And they did that to Israel and specifically Jerusalem in 69 AD. Basically flatlined all of it and even the temple. And the Greeks, not so much, because the Greeks weren't as unified as the Romans. If Alexander the Great, this is Shane's opinion, lived longer than he did, maybe so, but when he dies, so if you've got somebody that in 3 years conquers their known world, and then not long after that you die, so you haven't lived long enough to establish whatever reign and structure is going to be. So it became a free-for-all under the different generals. And then you actually can take the 4 quadrants of the Greek Empire under Alexander the Great and do your own study of each of those, because they then fraction a little bit, and we're going to deal with one particular area, who's this goat. So long answer to your question. They did to some degree, but it was always going to be subservient to the major rules and religious structure of the ruling power, if that makes sense. The Assyrians were probably the last real empire that just forced it all on you, where you just had to totally, you had to be completely subservient to everything. Because even Nebuchadnezzar, so think back to the beginning, right, of Daniel. Nebuchadnezzar does throw some, he does throw some accolades to Daniel and to Yahweh, and then even the Persians do that, right? So there is some level of that, but not in a sense of where it replaced their initial religious structure. So I don't know if that answered your question or not. So it's a long answer. You'd probably get glassed-eyed over it a while. Like, gosh, yes, no, how about that? Yeah, so I haven't been with y'all for a couple of weeks, so it's just all coming out now, right? Yeah, so, they're always going to be, and some of this was, so what we're going to find in the second half of this chapter is Antiochus was brutal to Israel. Now, Israel's pretty much not a nation, or a little bit. By the time that Antiochus is around, this is after the Persians, Cyrus did allow for Jews to move back home. That's when you have your Nehemiahs, you have your Ezekiels, your Ezra, and all of them. And so this is probably a couple hundred years after that. So there is rebuilding of the temple. There is setting up of some level of a nation state inside of the Persian Empire. But when this guy takes over after Alexander the Great and after the first general of what is now Syria dies out, I mean, he's sort of like a minor character until he gets the reins. And then once he gets the reign, he's just like brutal. And, I mean, he killed thousands of people, thousands of Jews. I mean, you know, like it was nothing. He actually he set up a big statue of Zeus inside of the temple in Jerusalem. So think back to your Exodus and your Old Testament, you know, early Old Testament. How would that be received? I mean, that's the quintessential just slap across the face that, you know, the most holy place inside of I mean, you've got, for Jews, you'd have Israel, inside of Israel, holy place, Jerusalem, inside of holy place, the real holy place, temple. Now, so it's inside the most holy of places. You've got, this guy sets up a statue, a huge statue of Zeus, and makes Jews come in and pay homage to it. So to give you some insight, if you fast forward a little bit to the Roman times, whenever this happened often in Jerusalem, whenever Rome would come in with their shields, which bore the image of the emperor, Jews would actually lay down outside the city to stop the chariots with their bodies. Now they would die. So the idea is there's no way in the world you're going to bring an image into our holy place. I mean, it's a level of revolt, all right? So you can imagine then what it would be like for someone to set up a statue of Zeus inside the temple a couple hundred years before, and then to make people worship and make people pray, and I mean, at the point of the sword. So I mean, this is not a good time. And on top of that, he stopped all the religious laws, which means they had to eat his food. They could not go to pray. No circumcisions. None of the things that were definitive Jewish when it comes to belief and faith and religion. All that was 86ed and stopped. They just so basically wiped out religious structure. Now this is an anomaly, okay? It's not like everyone, but this goat who eventually does war with, not just destroys the Persians, but who, one horn goes away and all these other horns come back up. So when we get into the one that replaces the four, he's talking about this guy. And he's just not a nice person. So that gives you insight into this, eventually who we're talking about. And, this little horn, so now we're in verses 9 through 14. Remember the goat's original horn, that falls off. Then there are four horns that come, and then there's this little horn that becomes the dominant one. And the dominant one he's just not. Verse 10, it grew until it reached the host of heaven. It threw some of the starry host down to the earth, trampled them. It set itself up to be as great as the prince of the host. It took away the daily sacrifice from him, and the place of his sanctuary was brought low, describing this part right here. And because of the rebellion, the host and the daily sacrifice were given over to it. It prospered in everything that it did, and the truth was thrown to the ground. So that's Daniel language talking about this guy here. And, he's just not a nice person. He set up his own priest, and his own puppet priest killed the high priest in, I think, like 70 A.D. And, I think a few years after that, he set up the temple. Obviously would kill thousands, like at a drop of a hat. So, and then you've got this number that 2,300 evenings and mornings that the sanctuary, until the sanctuary then is reconsecrated. Mm-hmm.
Is it generally accepted that this vision, chapter 8, this part of it was written by Daniel in Daniel's time?
Yeah.
In hindsight, 400 years later, they recognize.
Yeah. So people who come after that have to look back, right? But so Daniel's looking forward. Yeah, but that's the general rule is that Daniel.
Sometimes you hear that, it was added later.
Yeah, so it's kind of like a, pseudo like he had a secretary 100 years later. Yeah, 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 right. So I mean, all the visions in from 7 to 12, the um, most scholars. I mean, I would say pretty much every scholar. I mean, I'm sure there's a few that are not. This is at Daniel's own hand. So, yeah. So I mean, now when we get into chapters 9, 10, 11, 12, they're a little different. This one, of all the visions, this one's probably the easiest to sort of kind of peg because of how it played out. Some of the other ones is where, like in chapter 7, there's debate on is it first coming or second coming, and there's some general, there's some commonality, but trying to actually nail down when it is, that becomes harder. Eight's the easiest of them all. Good questions. All right, so let's take a break. We've been going at it pretty good, and it's a lot of history. So why don't we take a break for about 10 minutes, and we'll reconvene and go quickly. Some of the, I've given you some interpretation, so even though we'll look at the interpretation, there's a few things that we can add to it. Yeah. All righty, let's come on back. Did somebody do the prayer pad? I hope we did. Did y'all get a copy? Prayer pad. Did y'all get a copy? All right. So do we need to make copies? Okay. Yeah, Becky will make a copy, and we'll jump back in. Yeah, and the refreshment list. Did we send that around? I hope we did. Okay. Okay. Good. 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 All righty. So under Antiochus the fourth, I mean, he killed the priests at that time in Jerusalem. He stopped all the religious laws, inserted a statue of Zeus in the temple, and killed, again, thousands. I mean, there was one time, let me see if I can find it in my notes, in thinking about this, where he massacred, I mean, I forgot how many thousands of men, women, and children in one particular time. 80,000. Here we go. According to Second Maccabees, right? So this is where that non-canonical, it's called the Deeds of Murder in Second Maccabees 5:11 through 14, if you just happen to want to look at it, where slaughtered 80,000 men, women, boys and girls, even infants. I mean, all under his command, soldiers during that time when they attacked Jerusalem. So, again, just not a brutal person in his treatment of Jews in Israel, particularly Jerusalem, during this time of his reign. So he's the one that the little horn, you have the horn, the one horn in the goat, eventually it becomes four, and then out of the four there's a little horn who is considered to be deceptive, manipulative. I think the way the scriptures describe is he understands riddles, things of that nature. His rise to power was like that. Sort of a low person on the pole, and then through some cunning political maneuvers becomes the leader of that part of the Greek world for this time period. And obviously he's not only concerned with, I mean, and so his land is, if you can, it would be Greece, Israel, and then, but not into Egypt. That's ruled by another person. And then, but not over into what we would know as Iraq. That would be ruled by another person. But the Galatia area, Turkey, Israel, that was his area of one of the four divisions of Alexander the Great's empire. He had that portion. In 63 BC, he loses in a battle, or he lost a battle to one of the main rulers that controlled Egypt. And I can't think of the guy's name. And basically dies of a broken heart because he's not the guy he thought he was. So, go figure. I mean, he's not assassinated or he just dies, sad, for whatever it may be. But what Daniel's vision describes is how Daniel's vision gives a sort of like an overarching observation about Alexander the Great but then it really dials in to how it deals with Jews. And you see this in this development of the horns that took place. In 15 through the rest through 26, we get the vision interpretation. Now, what's typical to apocalyptic type literature is normally there's a dream or vision, and there's some level of interpretation, and the interpretation comes from divine origin. So this, you might remember, look at your notes from when we first started the book of Daniel, and I just gave you some book observations. This part of Daniel fits that genre of writing, and so think to what you know about Revelation. In Revelation, John sees a vision or has a dream, and then there's some level of interpretation that is given to him by divine origin, and that's what we'll see here. So we'll pick it up, verse 15, kind of go quickly through. When I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I sought to understand it, and behold, there stood before me one having the appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ui, and it called, Gabriel, make this man understand the vision. So he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was frightened and fell on my face. But he said to me, understand, O son of man, that the vision is for the time of the end. Now, let's stop right here for a second, because I want to notate a few things. There are two people that are having a conversation that will eventually lead to Daniel's, give an interpretation to Daniel. One of them we know by name, right? Who is Gabriel, right? So, again, Daniel is one of the, it might even be the only book in the Old Testament that actually, maybe, that actually mentions angelic beings by name. Now, where does Gabriel show up again? Yeah, right, in the Gospels, in Luke, with visions, and in Matthew. So we have these two. Now, the other being, we don't have a name. But what we do know, at least from the text, is that this being is dictating what that being is to do. So who might this be? Yes, right, so good answer. God. I mean, just by deduction, right? Or somebody of higher authority, higher up the food chain. And this one tells this one what to do. And then in that description, this one is the one that sort of dominates everything. All right? So I just wanted us to notate that you see some level of delineation between the two beings. And what we also know is that when Daniel is interacting with Gabriel, he's just receiving it. But when Daniel interacts with this one, he does what? He does what? Not just obeys. Look at verse 17. So he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was frightened and fell on my face. But he said to me, understand. So what we do know from other parts of the book of Daniel is that whenever Daniel interacts with an angel, there's not this fear and trepidation like it is when he interacts here. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind. All right?
In the earlier chapters, did they call him the Ancient One? Would that be the same idea?
Yeah, so one of the questions, or the question that was asked, is that you hear this concept or this title, the Ancient One, or the Ancient of Days. I think that's more of the literal translation. Yeah, so there are a couple of titles that are reserved for God that come out of Daniel. Ancient of Days is one of them. It's just not in chapter 8. Yeah, it's same concept. All right, so verse 18, and when he had spoken to me, I fell into a deep sleep with my face to the ground. He touched me and made me stand up, and he said, behold, I will make known to you what shall be at the latter end of indignation. Now, just stop right there and put a pin in that. There is debate, so if you have a study Bible, your study Bible might have some level of debate of what time period they're talking about. And for those who want to see the Antichrist in all things, they're going to move from this time period into some time period way in the future. But I would argue that the context shouldn't allow that. All right? But I'm just telling you, so if you're reading something else in the book of Daniel where somebody wants to find if there is just one Antichrist, if they want to find that one Antichrist, then if they're not careful, they can try to force it into the text, even when the context doesn't really give you permission to do that. We call that eisegeting the text, to read into the text what we want. All right, so you with me? Does that make sense? No? Yes? Because this is, so when it comes to biblical interpretation, the reason why I mention this is what we have to guard against is that if we have a theological thought or a certain belief, then we, instead of allowing the Bible to speak for itself, that might lean into what we believe, or might even lean against what we believe, we have to be careful not to force, for instance, the people who are wearing red and black. Today, you see Georgia everywhere, right? So it doesn't matter what's going on. I mean, it's like Georgia, Georgia, Georgia. Because you're riding high, national champions. So everything now is influenced from being the national champion 2 times in a row, right? So, all right, yay. All right, so, but we have to be careful not to read everything into red and black, right? So, and we do that, all right? So, I mean, it doesn't mean that the Bible wouldn't draw that conclusion with another passage, but you can't force what you have into every single text. Does that make sense? All right, so we have to be careful there. There are other passages that will talk specifically about Antichrist. All right? It just might not be here. But human nature is human nature, so if we're not careful, we can say, oh yeah, this is exactly what he's talking about here, when the context doesn't lend itself to it. So every Bible student, and you're one, we have to caution ourselves to read out of the text what the text wants to say, which creates a little bit of anxiety because sometimes we want the text to say more. And for that writer, in that particular time, that writer might not even be on that writer's radar screen. Now, it might be on another book of the Bible, but just let that book of the Bible speak to it, not force it into everything. All right? And so this is where I would argue with other scholars that want to take Antichrist, which is a theme that shows up in this style of writing, into everything. Because it just might not be consumed with it. All right, it might not even be on the radar screen. So for those of us who don't care about the red and black, we don't see red and black. Right? Yeah, exactly right. But I'm not going to, there's no reason to wear orange and blue right now. I mean, so I don't own any clothes that have red and black. So, I mean, I can't wear something that doesn't exist in my wardrobe. Someone, I think Brooke one year bought me this really nice red button-down shirt, and I remember going, when am I going to wear this? And so anyways, I think it stayed in my closet for a little bit, and then it was the proud owner to Goodwill. So, but on a different note, to be careful to allow the text to say what it wants to say. It doesn't mean that, even though the text might not address it specifically, it doesn't mean that there won't be that theological conclusion that's drawn when you look at the whole scope of the Bible, but just notate it that way. I mean, there are so many things, and we really have to be comfortable with this. There are so many things that the Bible just doesn't address that we wish that it would. And so what we have to do then is we just have to draw theological conclusions, but they're not always the biblical evidence that we want. It just might not be as much as we wish that it would be. All right? And so for Protestants, this is a big problem. And I'm a Protestant, or I gladly wave my Protestant flag. For Catholics, you have the authority of the episcopacy that sometimes speaks for the church when the Bible doesn't. Right? The main voice of that is the Pope. Okay? But for Protestants, there's not a main one. And so we have a tendency to wrench from the Bible what we want the Bible to say to justify what we want to believe before we even read the book. All right? So we just have to be careful. It's nothing to do with the book of Daniel. It's about biblical interpretation. It doesn't mean that the conclusions are not, doesn't mean the conclusions are wrong. Doesn't mean the conclusions aren't good. But to say, well, the Bible said it and here it is, well, you might be open to a little bit of debate. And in those debates, you have to sit with the context. And because there are just some things that, there's a ton of things. I have a list of all the things I wish Jesus addressed. But he didn't. And then, so I go to the next couple of sources, maybe Paul and the disciples and things like that. And, sometimes they address them, sometimes they don't. And so then the next thing is, okay, what about the second or third generation and their writings? They're not part of the Bible, but I'm closer to the original source. Maybe they address it. And then, if they don't, then you have to go to when all the church got together and hashed it out. Well, that's the next level of source that can be helpful. And then there's some things that exist in today's world that are completely different than what existed in that world. So there's no church mother or father even envisioned that something like this would even take place. So, you do the best you can with conclusions. And those are some of the hot buttons that we have today. All right? And so, when you think about, we're not going to go down those rabbits. I don't want to do that. That's I only got 10 minutes. But just things that involve science. Go ahead. Capitalize, not capitalize. Go back and look at the ones that are due with the title. Or if the context says one who looks like the Son of Man. And the context, like later on we get in the book of Daniel, or back in chapter 7, I'm talking about Son of Man here is lower caps, and it definitely refers to Daniel. Context tells you that's Daniel. There are other times where it's a title, and the context is easily to conclude that it's not Daniel. It has to do with angelic person or deity person. So that's where the context is helpful. Context is helpful to us in that interpretation. So, but yeah, this is one of the times where Son of Man is mentioned. Normally, when Son of Man in title, it is capitalized. All right? So, what verse? 19. Yeah, so verse 19 says, He said, Behold, I will make known to what shall be the latter end of the time of indignation is what I have. But wrath could be the time of wrath. For it, because I have a footnote, for it refers to the appointed time of the end. So the issue is, obviously, time of wrath describes the persecution. The debate is, what is the time of end? Is it a time of end, even more so in the future, that also has persecution? Or what was that? What did y'all say? Did I miss that? Okay. So is it describing time of wrath here, that this time is coming to an end? Or is it time of wrath, persecution, well into the future? I would argue that the context is here, not like very end of Book of Revelation. Mm-hmm. Sure.
But this one says the time of the end, in this case, refers to the whole period from the end of the exile until the second coming of Jesus.
Yeah, so that's what I was talking earlier, that I would argue they're forcing the time frame. Yeah, exactly what it is. Yeah, so I mean, because your study notes are nothing more than interpretation from a scholar. So just like in chapter 7, this is why, so apocalyptic literature is always going to have a debate over time. So go back, we looked at chapter 7. Time is always the issue, and because it's future looking. So is the future time something like here, or something like first advent, which would be the gospel coming of Christ, or is it second advent? Now, Joyce, your notes are talking about second advent. I would probably imagine that if you looked at all of your notes, every single vision of Daniel, chapter 7 and chapter 12, is always going to be dealing with that time. Up to the culmination of Christ's rule. So we're living in the in-between time of first advent and second advent. First advent is incarnation. Second advent is second coming of Christ. All right? So we're today, 2023, we're somewhere in this time frame. So from the time of incarnation and resurrection already happened to second coming sometime in the future, that's where we're living. So scholars, and this is what I was trying to explain earlier, scholars will either see apocalyptic future writing, which is, either about a time of the writer in the future of the writer, here, 400 years, or first coming, chapter 7, I would argue, or second coming, which other scholars also would argue. And the debate is really all over the place. So, what we do is we try to take the context and from the context draw our conclusion. Sometimes the context is clear, sometimes it's not. So if you are looking for a time in history where all of what Daniel 8, all of that is encapsulated, you will find it here. All right, so that's why I lean here. If you start with an idea that everything that Daniel's going to talk about involves Jesus and then those that are opposite of Jesus, Antichrist, you're either going to land in first coming or second coming. And the Bibles are going to be split, all right? So, I mean, if you have like I would probably argue NIV is probably going to lean more towards second coming. If you have, I'd have to go back and look. NRSV, something like that, maybe here. It's been a long time since I've tried to line up all the Bibles. I did that in seminary, but that's just where the scholars are going to be. What we have to be comfortable with this style of writing is it's got ambiguity. Because it's describing the future for Daniel, but what future? Is it the future here, 400 years? Is it the future a little over 500 years, 600 years in the first coming of Christ? Or is it always future for anybody who reads the book of Daniel, second coming of Christ? All right, so I mean, it's I'm not trying to say, there's enough evidence for everybody to live, all right? So I mean, I'm just kind of giving you my thoughts on this that I think it's describing here, because this time period, more so than this time period, and definitely more so in this time period, because you don't know when that is. All right? That this ties it off in a nice bow. But I've got a buddy of mine would say, nope, you're wrong. So and I got a family member that would say, sorry, Charlie, it's second coming. And all right. One of us will be right, one of us will be wrong. And I mean, I don't mean that, but it just is. So, but if we have a view that all apocalyptic literature is about end of times, the exact end of time, then it's always going to be here. I don't hold that particular thought. I think there's sometime that apocalyptic literature describes a future event from the writer's perspective that is a past events for us, because we're separated by about 1,500 years. And I think often the apocalyptic literature describes first coming. Now, some of it describes second coming, but first coming, because I'll tell you why I lean this place, and then we're going to have to stop. What God did in the person Jesus Christ, we only know a fraction of it. And we sometimes, I think, we sell it short. The kingdom that is established, that overcomes death, has no end. And so to put a time frame on it, I think, in the attempt to explain it, puts it in a box. Because what's true about the New Testament is that the defining victory of the resurrection is that God will make all things new. And the issue for mortal humans is physical death. Right? So when we talk about, so again, now that, I'll be the first to admit, that colors how I interpret apocalyptic literature. Because that is so dominant in my theology, I have to work hard not to read into the text what I want it to be. But I think the defining issue that the New Testament bangs in that gong all the time is the incarnation and the resurrection. What makes people Christian is Jesus. Not mission, not style of life. Because that is common to other religions, and there's a lot of commonality there. But what separates the one from the other is the person Jesus Christ. And so I think the book of Revelation, at least the large portion of the book of Revelation, is what the gospel does in written word, Revelation does in picture book. Now, the very end of the book of Revelation, Revelation, I think, talks a lot about first coming, and then it also flips over like this, all of history into the very end, but that's not all of the book of Revelation. I think it's just the very end of the book of Revelation. But there are people who would say, no, it's all future. I mean, like completely future. And I'm okay with that. It's not because I think every book of the Bible has its origin in some time of history. And so here, it's easy to see. In the book of Revelation, you have a new emperor who does some things and so then John, while on Patmos, he's in exile. It's like writing letters from the jail, writes to all the churches, or at least 7 of the major churches, says, stand firm now in the face of persecution. Well, why? Because Christ has come, and Christ will come again. So, but again, there are writers, scholars who, will, one of the chief commentaries that I'm using, using a couple for this study. I mean, everything is about second coming, which is fine, all right? So, I mean, but I don't agree with it. And because I don't think the context always gives liberty to do that. But if that's the case for someone, then again, you also have to think about this when it comes to our faith. There are some things that are essential, and there are some things that are not. And what's essential, regardless if you see it here or here or here, is the main theme of the book of Daniel is who is in control, who is sovereign. It's without question with the book of Daniel, and it's God. How that all gets played out, there's a little bit of debate. But what's essential to all aspects of Christianity, deity of Christ, Trinity, right? Now, inside of that, I mean, there's going to be a host of disagreement, and all you have to do is look at all the different denominations. It's like 1,000. Now, I think that's unfortunate. I think we've lost the ability to be unified on what's essential and live with some holding the non-essential with open hands. But, some of that is the church is beautiful, and at the same time, it's fragmented and messed up because it has broken people who are on their way to wholeness, but that's a journey, and it doesn't happen overnight. And so we weave in our own stuff sometime into what God desires. And the great thing about God is He doesn't say, "Oh, you go to your room." He just says, "We'll figure it out." Yeah, so the question is, do I believe or agree that there are some things that we just won't understand? I don't know if I would change the word believe to that's just a fact, because you've got the finite trying to understand the infinite. And even, so this is time and space are human constructs to help order. And so, right, yeah, so I mean, yeah. Yeah, so I mean, like, there's people who've been predicting the date of that forever, right? And none of them have gotten it right. So I mean, somebody's going to get it right, at some point, if you play long enough, right? So I mean, but I don't. I've given up on that, and I don't mean that. I'm just like, early on, I mean, I tried to figure out all this, and I wanted everything tied off in a nice bow, and the more I study the Bible, and the more that I observe humanity and faith, the more I don't know. And I don't mean that. That is not a. I mean, that's just an understanding that there are just things that I'm still in process learning.
And there's so much you can.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, so but trying to figure out a style of genre that is always future looking, and it writes with images, is always going to be subject to interpretation. And it doesn't mean it shouldn't be studied. And the great thing, it's in the Bible, which means we should study it. We should try to figure it out. But I mean, it's going to come with a sense of head scratching and pack a lunch, right? Because it's not easy. But that's just the nature of the Bible student. All right. So the long and short of it is, there's a little time issue here. There's an issue, as some have mentioned, I think, Joyce, that is it an actual person? Is it future looking? At the end, so this is the end of the chapter, is this time of wrath, this time of persecution. It does come to an end. The temple is restored. And that also is, you also see that in I think, 1 Maccabees. And the restoration of the temple is what holiday in Judaism? Hanukkah. So this is talking a little bit about Hanukkah. So now you know the rest of the story. Yeah, so the question is, maybe we could study the book of Maccabees. That's on the list. That's way on the list. We might need John to teach that one. So anyway, go in peace. May the Lord be with you. Great questions, everybody. Great questions.